University, people who are here face to face, and to say welcome to those who are listening in remote places in the world through streaming. It's always such a pleasure to participate in the Hay Festival, and it's an honor that they have asked the School of Architecture and Design each year to contribute with their special guests through their knowledge and sharing their work and ideas. I've followed the work of Kathryn Gustafson, landscape architect, for many years. It's really a pleasure to be here sitting next to you. As you probably know, she is a landscape architect recognized throughout the world for many projects over the years. She does have two firms, one based in London, Gustafson Porter Bowman, and the other one in Seattle in the United States, Gustafson, Guthrie, and Nichol. But that's not enough. She lives in France, so we'll figure that out in a few minutes. She is someone who conceives that all material has organic qualities that respond to the seasons, as well as to the air, heat, sun, and wind. She's someone who, through her designs, always takes into account the factor of time. And this is something very special and very difficult to do in the architectural world. Not only is she a landscape architect who has been recognized for her work, she has won many prizes and awards, and I'll just mention a few. She's an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, an honorary Royal Designer for Industry member, and a medalist of the French Academy of Architecture. She won the Jane Drew Prize, which is offered by the Architects Journal for Outstanding Female Professionals, the Chrysler Design Award, the Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize for Architecture, and she and her partners received the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape Architecture, and many, many more. You may know her work. You may have seen it in Millennium Park in Chicago at the Lurie Gardens. You may have seen it in Washington, D.C., around the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation campus. Perhaps Diana, Prince of Wales Memorial in the UK, or you will see her work in Valencia because her firm is the lead on a new park for Valencia. I won't go into any more information, but I will ask Kathryn, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. And Kathryn, I believe that you've brought some images so that we can all understand a little bit more of your work. So if you push the green button, and if our tech folks will connect the PowerPoint, we'll hear a little bit more about Kathryn.
Thank you very much. I think also you gave me a challenge on say, well, talk about yourself and what you think. And I went, boy, nobody's ever asked me what I think. And so I always just talk about projects, right? And so I had to kind of step back and say, okay, what I think, well, that comes from where you're from. And these are the two offices, so it's all these beautiful projects I don't do all by myself. I mean, there is quite a team that works on them, and I'm from a small town in Washington State that's a high plateau desert that actually nothing grows in. It's not going forward. Oh. So it's basically bare hills, it's desert, and the only thing that happens is the Army Corps of Engineers brought in water. And so it's a little bit like what I call Campbell's soup. If you just add water, it will work. And this is what happens. Then it's a big agricultural community that has canals everywhere that conduct water. and that water creates abundance. And so in a lot of my work, you will see water. And it's from this living, and I do a lot of sculpted land. A lot of people think that came from other places in my life. And this is not. I went to art school in New York, and I did fashion design. And from there, a lot of people say, oh, it's all the landscape sculpture is about fashion. It really isn't. It's about where I was raised. And then I moved to France, because as a fashion designer, that's what you do, right? And after a few years, I decided that I wanted to change and go back to school, and I went to the École Nationale Supérieure de Paysage in Versailles to get my landscape degree. They taught me what monumentality was, as if Paris doesn't already teach you about monumentality. And it's the strength of this French landscape that I found so contemporary and so historical. And also, coming from an art background, art has always been a definition of landscape for me. And so some of my favorite artists, like Dennis Oppenheim, who talks about his body on the land, and this is one of my favorite pieces. It's called a service station for ideas. If you're out of ideas, you pull up and fill up. It's a wonderful piece. But also many of our classic painters talk about what they love about landscape, that anticipation, the pathway, the colors, the sky, the sunset, how it changes things. And then the mood, and whether the mood is something reassuring or threatening. I have used this term, place that fits, from the very beginning, because for me, if you can't design something that is for that place, we don't do Hilton hotels that all look the same around the world. We really need to fit into the place we're designing for. And Valencia is a good example of that, where when I first went there, I saw all this food and the ceramics and the bowls. And so the whole concept was a series of bowls, like the sketch. And then the bowls are also attached to the environment, because you have the yulas, which is that grassy knoll curve that's over by the sea, where all the natural water from the rivers come in, they fill the bowls, and then it filters through the sand into the aquifer. So the different bowls became different places for people, and then I used landform to form the bowls and form different experiences for people. And so we have a park today that is the first phase. There's a huge rail line that cuts the city in half, and it starts with a major piece, which is the Arts Center here, which is a historical building restoration, and a huerta, and a vegetable garden that is the huerta, that talks about all the food that is grown in Valencia and all the traditional agricultural techniques. It was also an occasion for me to finally work on a green wall that's sustainable, that doesn't require fertilizers, constant irrigation. It's a series of materials from the region that creates these bowls that have rocks on them, and it's tilted so the rain goes from one bowl to the other, and it's all with indigenous plants. It's also the canals of Valencia that bring you into the park from anywhere you approach, and also the relationship of planting to history and to the floral heritage of Valencia. It fits. When it opened, I knew we got it right. It feels like Valencia. And people absolutely love it, which is fantastic. The other thing that's really important is, a designer, you need, like with Valencia, a conceptual backbone, something you can hang on to, and that the people you're explaining to it can hang on to it because they understand where you're going with something. And so Diane is a good example of a very strong backbone. It's called letting out, letting in and reaching out, because she was one of the first royals to use her power, way before Angela Jolie or anybody else, to help kids. She really used her fame in a very interesting way. And so this is a memorial to her and her very, very complex life. But she is a mother, an oval, and she is full of richness and change and turmoil and champagne and calm. So it's a strong concept and it hangs together. But the other thing I try to tell young designers when I'm mentoring is a design has to do more than one thing, okay? It can't just be one. And so, like this in City Center, DC, this was a big city block that had a convention center on it, had closed off streets. We came back in, they moved the convention center and put in all the old alleys, all the old streets. And this fountain was on L'Enfant's plan from the very beginning, so we put in the new fountain and created a plaza. This is 6 city blocks, so this is a teeny part of this project. It's a place that has tactical. It's also a place of wonderment, and you meet friends. But it's also a place to get fit at 7 a.m. So it has to do many things when you're working in a urban environment. Often I find myself having to fix things. And I don't know if I don't think it's true with architects as much as landscape. There's so many past mistakes. And the 60s, as you can see, did a few of the major ripping across landscape with freeways, no stormwater management, cutting through native areas. And this is the entry to Marseille, and at the bottom of the photo is a natural protected landscape, and there's a 100-meter drop from that down. And this is what they did to that landscape. They just dug it out. They filled it in, and so they asked me to put 1 million cubes of earth in and redo the stormwater management because they were digging a tunnel someplace else and didn't know what to do with the dirt. And so this is the model, and raising these huge walls of 12 meters, but also collecting all the water and taking the water into a basin and marking it with these huge concrete beams. So when the water comes up, it leaves a watermark, so all the public can see how much impervious surfaces we're doing. And so understanding how we're treating the environment and how do we repair it. So this is the project, the same image you saw before, with these walls with local stones, native vegetation, and our concrete pillars inside the stormwater management telling the story of the water. And all native vegetation replanted all the way up the hill to the top. This is another opportunity, very quick. It's my first project in 1983. It's stormwater management again, where they had 300,000 cubic meters of soil, and they were paying too much to get off site. They asked me to do something with it. So I did a land sculpture with it that has turned into be a rural regional park in the area. So there is a concept behind it, but I don't have time to explain everything. The other thing is finding opportunities. I think it's really important for me to find things as they change. You can't fight everything, although I really try to. But this was the American Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The main concept is you have to cross water to come into America if you're African American. So to this museum, you have to cross water to get in the museum. Unfortunately, David Adja's beautiful facade went way over budget, and so my water feature on Constitution was VE'd out. That's called value engineering. So I decided, well, I have to have a security wall, I'll just make it look like water. And so I built a 200-meter long, 5-meter wide, black granite wall. I call it my big black wall. And it's shiny and it looks like water, Well, it's just turned out to be the hot spot in DC to hang out. All the food trucks are there, you know, people hang out there, people meet there. It's warm, it heats up. In the spring, you have your back to the sun, the food's in front of you, all your friends are hanging out. So it's been a real surprise and an opportunity. And this is my latest opportunity. It's the 52 hectares of Paris, from Palais Chaillot through the Eiffel Tower all the way to the École Militaire. It was a competition. I walked this site every morning for 3 years, going to school to get my train to Versailles. So I knew it by heart. And so I've said to the city, I said, no, it's not your site. This is my site. I know it, but it is being destroyed. And it's being destroyed by over-programming a landscape and trying to get a landscape to make money when that's really not its role. Its role is to give you a healthy environment within your city. It is ripped apart, it is compacted, it's a real mess. So the one thing we did, it's called One, is across the entire, it's a long way, I think it's 3 kilometers. I took out all the cars so that people pedestrians walk from one end to the other and never cross a vehicle, except for public transportation, bikes, and emergency. First thing at Trocadéro was a round point, a new space that takes away the vehicles, creates the magic, creates the view. It's very respectful of historical. It's one of the most important historical landscapes in the world. And as you move down, there is this restoration and bringing it back into biodiversity, more permeable surfaces. We've reduced by 35% the impermeable surfaces just in the first phase, bringing in more seating options, more vegetation, more green, closing a bridge, having the bridge connect the park on either side and become part of the park, redoing underneath the Eiffel Tower where it has the traditional, what Eiffel did is the feet were to land in a garden. So bringing that garden back in and extending the landscape tradition all the way to the end, to the École Militaire. I could talk about this for 2 hours and show you all the work we've done on the drainage, the decompaction for the trees, the way to have more seating that's integrated, the handicap access. It's just very, very complex as a project, and trying to get this complex a project built in Paris is probably one of the toughest things I've ever done in my life. But I am enjoying it. So the past is history, the present humanity, the future's ecology, and this project we call continuity is history, unity is humanity, and diversity is not only nature, but diversity is humanity also. So, you know, because a line is straight, it doesn't mean it can't be mysterious and poetic and a space of discovery. And so finding those opportunities, finding a way to bring that emotion into a project. And I swear, if you get emotion to a project, people are touched and they will take care of it and they will love it. And I think that's one of the most important things. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you, Kathryn. I have to... Oh, goodness.
I'll leave it on that one because that's nice.
So lots of questions. Let's start big and then come down small. You're quoted as saying, "Landscape is not just a park, it's everything around us. The moment you walk out the door, you're in a landscape. I see in some of your projects, they are parks. Some projects are settings or places where people will gather or walk. And others, landscapes could be a little bit more just places around buildings, sort of more natural places. Do you have a hierarchy or typologies of landscape? What unifies the work you do? And do you separate into different types of landscape as you approach your work?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that exactly the way you may want, because I'm not, I'm instinctive. I'm not, I'm very, very, I'm very instinctive. I'm not intellectually multi-layered like some people that have their typologies. I think for me, it's walking into a situation, looking at it and say, what needs to be done? And how do you make it so it really is special? And so the other thing that I'm finding more and more, I used to not want to work on sidewalks, and more, we're doing such interesting work with sidewalks and taking over lanes of traffic and transforming streets. And I think there's this whole movement to go to electric car, more public transportation, diminish the amount of cars in a city, take over those streets, take over those sidewalks, make them part of your everyday life as you walk out the door and you go to work and you walk through a landscape or through a park. You bring down the heat value, you bring in the shade value, you bring in the humidity. There's just a whole lot of things that helps people's lives. And I think that as I grow, I learn more and more all the time of where those opportunities, where I start out very much as in an art place. And as I grow more into still the very sculptural part, but a big part of plants and understanding indigenous plants, understanding historical plants, medical plants. I mean, it's a big world that's really fascinating and what it brings to you.
So talk to me about complexity, because that's another aspect of any landscape, any project, but especially landscape projects, because you're dealing with so many things that you've mentioned, the water cycle, time, how it affects the plants, the different seasons, how people interact. What does it mean culturally, historically for a place? How can you approach such complexity? How do you do it in your firms?
The first thing we do, we study a place longly. I mean, we take a lot of time to figure out from the beginning when there was no humans, and then as it evolved and the history, so then you have nature and culture moving together all the time. I think that complexity, and then you add that to city and today's world and the social complexity of the diversity of people and the economic complexity, and then with that, obviously there is a whole nother layer that we didn't have until after 9/11, which is security, which is this huge new world that is totally bonkers and crazy and excessive. But it's something you have to do, and it's something you have to deal with. And so finding that the teams are bigger and bigger, trying to get all of these things to work together. So the ecology and biodiversity, whether it's in the fauna and the flora, the soils, Then we go back to security, how people move. Work with people like movement strategies and that actually study how people move and what is the capacity of a space. So they help us understand why we're designing what that capacity is. Obviously, architects, engineers, civil engineers, you know, I can go on. I mentioned to you earlier, our Eiffel Tower team is 25 offices of different disciplines, and we're all working all the time, trying to just do the first phase.
How do you coordinate, especially now with COVID? It's even more difficult than normal.
You know, I worked on the Villette Park right in the beginning of my career, and it was a big park, and it had the museum by Fancelberg, and it had, you know, Tschumi with his conceptual piece, and there was Paul Delouvrier, who was the president of it, François Barré, who was, you know, head of Pompidou at the time. The bug bit me. It was a big, complex project, and I loved it. I loved how difficult it was to get it right, and how much organization you have to do to coordinate that, and had some really good teachers, and have some, and you know, in the offices, and we often have exterior project managers. That is one of the expertise. We have managers that just manage your construction site because that is what they're good at. And so it's finding what people are good at and getting them into conversations is really interesting.
Do all the disciplines that participate in your teams come together at the very beginning, or are they brought in over time?
No, pretty much all at the beginning.
At the beginning,
Yeah.
You said something before, I don't know if you want to repeat it, about architects and architecture. Because I listened to you talk about landscape architects. It sounds so logical. So you're so passionate about it. When I look at the African American Museum, I think, well, why was it more important, the facade of the building and going over budget, and why wasn't the landscape first and then reducing the facade of the building? So you're very passionate about what you contribute to the environment, whether it's a building, a monument, a park, a sidewalk. Why don't we see things that way?
I think landscape suffers from this idea that, hey, I garden, I can do it, right? You know, it's like you don't really think you could build a house, but you think you could probably do a landscape. And it's sort of like somebody who paints once in a while saying, no, I can be a really good painter, right? And so I'm going, yeah, right. So it's part of not understanding the field. It's our fault as landscape architects of not explaining the field. It's also part the architect's fault for thinking they can do it and doing a very bad job of it. And because often I found architects think they can do everything. And you know, maybe it's a little bit like surgeons. There's a certain personality that goes into being an architect or being a surgeon. And my dad was one. So maybe it's a professional fault, you know, I don't know. But there's this ego that I can do everything. And you know, there is so complex out there. The environment is so complex. The people, the diversity, the culture, you really need more voices than one. And the older I get, the more collaborative I get. Mm-hmm. Because it's so much better. It's so much richer.
I think that there is a change I have to speak about our own school here in Segovia. I think that there is a change to understanding the collaborative nature of professions. I think also it depends on the history, if it's polytechnic, if it's more artistic. It depends on the history of a country and how architects and architecture has been seen. But I do think that with more diversity in the profession, with different roles having to be dealt with when you're undertaking a complex project, people realize it's much better to collaborate across disciplines. When you look at, yeah, go ahead.
I don't mean to be horrible with architecture, but it is one of the best educations in the world.
It's very complex,
because it's very broad, and it actually prepares you to live, which I find very interesting. So you do find people who have studied architecture in museums or in social sciences or because it's so mathematical, sociological, you know, it covers a lot of ground. So I think that is something very, very valuable, to not lose the complexity of the education.
Yeah. Is landscape architecture becoming more complex now with global warming, with more pressures, not only on the landscape, but through politics, through social movements, things like that? Do you see a change?
It's filling a bigger and bigger role in people's lives and in understanding how to make a city healthy, how to stay healthy, there are a lot of conversations about how do you make a space equitable? What is equity? How do you talk about equity? How do you design for equity? I think these are conversations we didn't have. We should have had, but I think there's this, what I find fascinating about society, it's constantly on the move. And so anything you design, it's of that time. And it's really of that time because you're within this social intellectual complex. And so as that moves, hopefully you're moving with it and understanding, trying to adapt our landscape architecture to it. And obviously, you know, I'm old enough that I was at Woodstock, okay? So we were hippies that we've been talking about the environment forever, and we kind of gave up because, you know, we hit the 80s, nobody even believed in it, and, you know, and then finally we get to the age of power, and, you know, the environment's come back, and I wonder why, you know? Needed Woodstock.
It was really interesting to me, Kathryn, you spoke about the artistic nature, and I know that you make a lot of models when you're approaching a project, but then there's all this scientific part that has to do with water cycles and pollution and understanding the carbon cycle and climate and things like that. Where do you fit in that? Have you also changed in your focus over the years?
We all change. I just been working on the tidal basin in Washington, D.C., and I'm part of a think tank because of global warming, the seas are rising, and the cherry trees are dying, and they're being flooded. And so it's a very, very complex social, economical, climate project. So yes, I mean, as with climate change, and one thing I talk about there, and I've talked about in other places, our aesthetics are changing. And our aesthetics are changing for some very good intellectual reasons, in that we understand more and more what damage we're doing to the climate. So maybe we don't need decorative Japanese trees, and maybe we do need adaptive floodplain trees. Maybe we do need to understand what we're doing on the ground, and maybe as a global understanding of what we're doing, slowly pull back some of those things and try to make a more resilient and more a landscape that really listens to the problems and tries to solve them.
How is it possible to look at different scales, not in terms of size of landscape, but what I mean is, I lived in Chicago many years and loved to go to Millennium Park, to the Lurie Garden. Every season was different. Every year was different. And it wasn't the snapshot. Here it is, the snapshot. We always see the garden the same way. Every time you took another picture, it was changing, and it was beautiful all the time. That seems to be easier to do when you're dealing with a certain space. How can you take that idea of time and understanding on a global level? It just seems daunting to me that, do you think on the global level when you approach a project? Do you think about global warming?
I think we all think about global warming. Just look at the fires in Washington State, my state right now. We all are trying to go, what in the hell did we do wrong? You know, and how do we stop it? And then it comes down to a very personal level of how do you deal with rooftops in a city? How do you stop doing that heat gain? How do you use those spaces productively? And so, and I think at one point, I think you asked me about what I thought about urban food. I think the urban food is very important for education. It's also important for lifestyle for people. It's important for connectivity to your community. The real problem with food is the mass agriculture that is happening and how that agriculture is happening. What are the products? What are the methods? And that agriculture has to be changed. And if we don't change the agriculture, we're just running our heads into a wall. And so there is the micro of things you can do on a very small scale, but you have to have a voice on the macro. And I think that covers a lot of different things. Did you see the latest research that came out last week out of California that asphalt actually pollutes more than cars? Bingo.
Yeah, yeah.
So now we got to get rid of asphalt, okay?
Yeah.
So for me, in my profession, that's just like, oh my God, now I've got to rip up all the asphalt, and I've got to find a replacement.
Kathryn, talking about change, what about change in clients? And let me jump back, because Kathryn Gustafson worked for private enterprise at the beginning of your career. Esso, L'Oreal, was it Esso or and different
both.
company?
Both.
So
Shell.
what was it like working for private clients? And now I think you work for public and private. Do you see a difference? Do you see, do you have to approach those projects differently?
I think it's totally different when you have a company like Shell Petroleum or L'Oreal Cosmetics or Esso. Esso I had the most fun with because they'd just done Valdez. So I wanted to put a tar painting in their boardroom, but it was fun. But it's a beautiful project. But you're representing their mission statement, basically. You're trying to explain them to the world, but you're also, part of your job as a landscape architect is that they understand that they are in an environment. So it's very different from working with a developer like in CCDC, who is going to build part of a city. So he's going to do condos, he's going to do rental, he's going to do offices, hotels, you know, different things in different spaces. So it has a completely different focus. They're all necessary. They're all necessary as far as how you communicate who you are. I found Shell Petroleum one of the best teachers in my life. That the Claude Ingalls, who was the director at the time for what I was doing, Claude Nichols, he had built refineries. So he had a process of building that was so disciplined that all of us just came out of that project with so much better equipped to build than we had ever been before. And how to dialogue and how to communicate. He was absolutely extraordinary. So I figure all clients are, you know, a learning experience. Now, there are some that, you know, are really bad, and I just won't work with them.
Yep. Have you been able to teach a client, change a client who approached a project and because of working with you and your firms?
Claude Nichols, first time he saw my plan, he said, "Too many plants." And then I started bringing him books, you know, and then he started learning his trees, and then you know, I was putting some magnolias, and I said, well, why don't you come to a nursery with me, and I'm going to be choosing some of the plants for your project, and also for L'Oreal Cosmetics, some of the magnolias. And he saw me pick out the magnolias for L'Oreal, and he said, but they're bigger than mine. I said, but you said too many plants. And he said, no, I'll just buy the nursery. So he just went from here to here. And I thought it was fascinating.
So what arguments do you use to convince clients? Do you talk about carbon dioxide reduction? Do you talk about cleaner air, health of the people, less respiratory diseases or something? Or how do you convince people?
It's often the client that comes to you talking about those things when you're with a city client. So like the city of Paris has got the mayor is a very green movement. And so she has an agenda that is there. So I think today people are so aware of the environment that it's pretty rare that I have to say, hey, you know, people are kind of going, and it's interesting, we've found that somebody will come to us and say, yeah, we'll do it, but only if we can do all native planting. And they said, perfect. You know, so there's this, all of a sudden you're saying, these are my rules, and they're going, that would have been exactly what we wanted. So they didn't know they wanted it, but then when you bring it to them, they go, well, of course. And so not always, you know, so it depends.
And Kathryn, you're not teaching now, and I'm not sure if that's because you have so much on your plate to do, to be in the academic world would just be too time consuming. But maybe you can tell us why or why not, why you're not teaching. But from your vantage point, what would you change in higher education in terms of architecture, landscape, urbanism, things like that? What would you add or subtract?
I think in landscape there has been a lack of design, teaching design. Just basic, really compositional. You know, think about when you first go to art school. What do? You know, what is a composition? What is a color palette? What is, you know, just basic art, and then basic design, basic humanities. I think landscape for a long time was an accompaniment. And it was a full-on art when we had Lenotre, and then we moved into a period that was doing some really beautiful picturesque gardens through the 1800s up to 1910. Then we hit the First World War, and landscape kind of went to a screeching halt. In World War II, a super screeching halt. And then when you come back into the 50s, it's all about rebuild, rebuild, rebuild. And then the landscape became a utilitarian sports field. And then it became a security problem because the police couldn't drive around in a car and see through the bushes, so you have to cut all the shrubs down. I mean, it just turned into something, and trying to grab that back and come back into the art of designing and designing responsibly, I think there is a huge movement, and we can thank very much Harvard, Peter Walker, Martha Schwartz, Church. There's some very, very important people, Jacques Asgar, Michel Courageux in France, that were really breaking, Jacques Simon amazing man in France that started in the 70s to really start working with design. And I just think the education isn't there, and it needs to be more emphasized there. Everything needs to be more emphasized, but I think really good design and really understanding design, I think it makes things work better, they're more harmonious, they last longer. Design's good, it's not frivolous.
What about the changes we're seeing due to COVID? You mentioned taking back streets and having different types of activities on the sidewalks, broader sidewalks, things like that. Do you see changes that we'll have in our cities and our city landscape due to COVID? Will they stay in the future?
I think so. I think I've worked for 20 years, so for me it wasn't really a big change, but for so many people it's been a discovery that they can work. But there's something happening with COVID that I'm sensing, is that we miss being together, and that inner reaction of being together creates this energy and synergy. And so I think let's hope that COVID isn't going to cause us all to stay home all the time and just be remote. But on the other side, it's one of the strangest things we've ever been through. And I think people understand more now that we're closing streets in Paris and all the restaurants are on the streets, and people are saying, we didn't really need that street, and we didn't really need that one over there, and we don't need to park cars everywhere. And so it's, we're doing pocket parks, taking over parking spaces in Seattle, and people are getting more used to not having so many cars around, and they like it. Lanes are getting reduced. I mean, why do we have these 12-foot lanes in America, when, a 10-foot will work? And so it's things like that, and trying to, so is that COVID? Is that just an overall reclaiming our lives and making our lives in cities really good and interesting? I think.
Let's hope it's that, and let's hope even after COVID subsides, we continue on that path.
But there's a lot of interesting things coming out of COVID.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, somebody said that because of COVID, it's forced us to leap ahead 10 years. We probably would have gotten there in 10 years, but this is one of those big pushes that we have. We can't stand still. We have to move quickly. Kathryn, in the few minutes that are left, what type of, first of all, tell us what projects we should keep our eye on. I know Valencia was the first phase. I'm assuming there are more phases to come in Valencia. We'll look at Paris.
You guys need to militant that. You need to get out there and talk to your government and get those. The whole idea in Valencia is we got to put the train tracks underground.
Okay.
So that we can reconnect that city.
Okay.
It's expensive.
We'll remember that. Are there other projects coming down the line that we should look out for? And then my other question is, if there's not one on the drawing boards, what would you like?
Okay, so there is a very interesting park in Osaka that I'm working with Sejima on, and Sana, and also working with Sejima in Australia, on Art Gallery New South Wales, sort of an art land piece, doing a Hong Kong. An entire building has been taken down to make a football field size garden in the center.
Wow. And
putting all that parking underground and building 5 new city blocks that are sustainable, environmental. So that is really, as a urban, it's the greenest thing that's ever happened in Hong Kong since, the English garden in the 18th century or something. So it's very exciting. And building in Pittsburgh on a really difficult industrial site that was a steel site, and the pollution is absolutely extraordinary, and the robustness of that city, and there's just this strength that comes out of it, and it's 85 acres. And I'm not doing the 85 acres, but I'm working on doing what we call the candy, the first landscape piece, saying, and for once we're doing the landscape before the buildings, and so then the buildings will come in, and so we're just doing parts of the landscape, we're doing all the streets, we're doing all the trees, and so it's set up to be almost like plug and play, but it's the landscape first instead of last, which is really interesting.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Is there a project that you would love to do? Is there something on your wish list?
I think I'm doing it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
A wish list? No, I think I'm doing it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, the Eiffel Tower is it's up there.
I think on that note, which sounds so positive, we will keep our eye on your future projects, Kathryn. On behalf of the Hay Festival, IE School of Architecture and Design, and the whole university, thank you so much for traveling here and for sharing with us. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.